guys, it's Thomas here. Today we are finally putting some plants into the LowTech plant tank. I'm going to talk to you about what a LowTech plant actually is, and also give you some examples of LowTech plants you could use for your tank, and then show you what I got for this one. It's in there, and you can see it, but there's plastic creating a shroud of mystery. So what is a low-tech plant? Well, I would generally consider any plant that is able to do well, thrive, survive, and grow, even if it's slowly, under low lighting conditions, low CO2 conditions, and obviously also low fertilizer conditions. Some of my favorite plants to use in a low-tech system are Anubias, cryptocorynes, vallisneria. I also like to use Java ferns, Java moss, moneywort, pennywort, hornwort, guppy grass, Hygrophillia species, rotella like indica or rotundifolia, which won't get as red and will grow slow, but it's doable. Styrogene repens, Ludwigia repens, which probably won't get as red and might not grow as fast, but it's still very doable. And you can also do topwater plants like floating plants such as duckweed or frogbit. So whenever you're getting plants for a new system like this one or an existing planted tank, it's pretty important you go over those plants to make sure they don't have anything on them that they're going to bring into the tank that you don't want there. Things like blackbeard algae, snail eggs, which will turn into snails, or snails, which will lay eggs and turn into more snails, which is not good. So what I like to do is I like to comb over and inspect the plants, but you can also do things like a dip solution that you dip the plants in for a period of time before they go in the tank. People usually use things like hydrogen peroxide, weak bleach solutions, or even potassium permanganate. I'm personally not going to do those. I find they can be a little harsh on the plants, and if you have sensitive plants, it can be pretty catastrophic for them. So I'm going to avoid that. You can also quarantine plants, but because this is a brand new system and there's nothing else in it, there's really no point in quarantining. I can't really add something to the system to, foul it or interrupt the other plants because it's naked of plants. There's no plants. Those are the only plants. Those plants are going in. Let's do those plants. So for this build, I decided to use only 2 different species of plants. One I've actually got 3 subspecies of, but I wanted to keep it super simple and show you guys what you can do with only 2 species of plants. So for the background, the first plant I have here is the cryptocoryne crispitula. I like it because it's got long, flowy, wavy, kind of seaweed-like leaves, and it's going to stand up nice and tall and flow across the top of the water once it's fully grown. Next up for the mid-ground, I've got a cryptocoryne wendtii trompica, which is going to have some nice rouginess or even brown in the foliage, which is going to be nice and break up all the green that you're going to see from the styrogene repens. Let me stick this guy right here. This is going to be my kind of transitional foreground and 2 mid-ground plants. They get fairly tall, around 4 to 5 inches if you let them get that high. I'm going to be trimming this back so that it carpets quite nicely. So, it's going to be, like I said, foreground, and then as I trim it, I'll kind of slope it so it works into the background. And then just as kind of an accent plant to drop around in specific parts of the tank, to kind of marry to the first cryptocoryne I put in is this little cryptocoryne albida, and this is the brown variant. Now these are all plants from Tropica, and I actually very much so trust Tropica plants. I've had really good success with them. They always seem to come in immaculately clean. I still will be going over them a little bit, and I'll show you how I do that just to make sure there's nothing on them that I don't want on them, but Tropica has always been really great for me, so I tend to stick with their plants unless there's something that I need that they don't have, which doesn't happen often because they got tons. Now plants come packed in different ways. This plant is in a pot and it's got some rock wool on the bottom. So I'm going to show you how you can prepare these types of plants. All of the ones I got are like this for planting, because you don't want to just throw that in your substrate. It's not going to work. But plants also come packed in other ways. Sometimes they will be on top of rocks or already attached to driftwood. And floating plants will often just be in a bag of water or sitting in a cup. Moss oftentimes as well is just in a little plastic cup, and you just have to pull it out and work with it that way. I think this is probably one of the more complicated ways to receive plants. It's really not that hard to deal with though. You just got to be gentle, so this is how we do it. First thing you're going to want to do is just gently remove the plastic container that's over top of the rock wool, and then usually you'll see where the rock wool is divided. And when you're removing the rock wool, you want to do it a layer at a time. Just put it off to the side. And the reason you do it like this is to try to prevent tearing too many of the roots, which are going to be growing, as you can see, all through the rock wool. So nice and slow and gentle until you get it all off. So now I've got all the rock wool removed, and from this point, you can actually even start dividing the plants. You can see that this one is almost dividing itself. It's basically a group of small plants. And the nice thing about that is you can spread out the plant in the aquarium when you plant it to create a fuller look right away, and then the plant will get thicker and grow in rather than having it bunched and then having the plant work, you know, kind of its way along the gravel. So starting out all splayed will look fuller than just having one really full plant sitting over here. Before I plant the tank, I'm gonna thoroughly soak down the substrate because hard, dry substrate and plant roots don't get along very well. So I'm gonna soak it down really well, and depending, I may actually add water right up to about the top of the gravel just to make it even easier on the plants as it's going in. To inspect my plants and essentially comb over them to make sure there's nothing I don't want there, what I'm actually doing is looking at all the stems of all the foliage, getting nice and deep in there to make sure there's no clusters of snail eggs. Snail eggs will often be under the leaves as well, so we also want to look at the underneath of all the foliage on the plant and just essentially make sure that there's nothing on there we don't want getting into the tank. So this plant is actually looking really clean, which is really reassuring. Like I said, Tropica, for me, I've found them to always have very clean plants. And I see nothing else anywhere, no algae or anything. Sometimes you'll also find that there is some algae on the leaves, sometimes on the edge of the leaf if we're talking blackbeard algae, or even just spotted algae on top of the foliage. But this plant looks perfect, and that's what I want all my plants to look like. So even when I'm looking at something teeny tiny, like this little cryptocoryne, it looks like I've lost a little bit of foliage just from shipment, but that's no big deal because it's going to grow back relatively quickly. But again, I don't see any snail eggs, which are little masses of clear jelly with tiny, tiny speck-like white dots, and I don't see any algae. And I'll take a look at maybe a strand of this stem plant, Styrogene repens, as well. See if I can find something to show you. No, you know what? This plant's actually looking really, really clean as well, which is just perfect. Because that means I can just worry about planting and a lot less worry about things being in the tank that shouldn't be there. Awesome. When I'm planting plants, I like to grab a pair of tongs. These ones are very thin tipped. It makes it a lot easier to push into the substrate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over top of the plant, and I'm going to grasp it lightly with the tongs so that the top of the tongs here are grabbing onto where the leaves and the roots meet, because that's going to be the firmest spot on the plant. And then I like to have the tips lower like this so that they protect the roots as they go into the substrate. So now that I've got one of each type of plant in there, you can kind of see what I'm going for. I actually sketched this out on a photograph I took of the aquarium just on my cell phone. Let me show you what that looks like real quick. So in that image you saw at the bottom there's like a green swirl. For the foreground plant, that's the styrogene. You can also see that there is a lighter green, kind of a bunch of what looks like grass. That is my accent cryptocorin. The tall ones that are swishing across the surface at the back, those are my nice tall cryptocorins, and they're my background plant. I really am hoping they'll kind of swoop across the surface like I have in the photo there once they're fully grown and kind of encase the aquascape in loveliness. And then I've got the big bushy cryptocorins in there as well. I know I have, I think, 3 of them as the red plants in the photo. I may drop it down to 2, or maybe even just keep the 1. I haven't fully decided, but I wanted those in there because the leaves are nice and spread out and bushy, and the small fish that I'm intending to put in this tank will probably appreciate being able to swim within them, which I think will look visually very cool. So I'm gonna keep on planting, and we will see how this turns out in just a moment. Hopefully very well. So the tank is now finally planted. I'm not gonna put fish in right away. That'll be another episode. I want the plants to kind of settle in. I'll be dosing a bit of fertilizer and a CO2 supplement, but I'll talk about that in the next episode. Planting was actually, it came together pretty well, pretty much what I expected. But I will say the Cryptocorin crispulata, which is the tall plant at the back, was a little bit more difficult planting than I had anticipated, mostly because the plant itself is very thin. So when you have it in your tongs or tweezers and you're pushing it into the substrate, when you open up the tweezers to pull them out, it creates a little bit of a kind of cavity in the substrate, and that cryptocorin wants to come straight out with the tweezers even when you let go of it. So that was a little bit difficult. I basically used the tweezers after I'd let go to kind of squish the substrate back in around the crispulata, and that worked pretty well. I would also say it's probably the most delicate plant of the bunch that came in. So through shipping, some of the foliage on that plant wasn't pristine. There was a little bit of die-off, nothing crazy. The plant should bounce back real quick anyways. I also really like how the styrogene rep ends at the bottom, what I basically used as the carpet, what it looks like filled out in the tank here. Now, I will say this isn't what it's going to look like. once everything grows in and I get to trim it all. This is kind of just how it starts off. The whole idea with that repens there or the styrogene repens is to trim it all down super short once it settles in and takes in and roots nicely. And that'll allow it to kind of start regrowing outwards and get new foliage that'll be nice and compact and closer to the gravel, and it'll have a much nicer carpeting effect. Right now it's kind of all willy-nilly all over the place. But I think you get a general idea of how this is going to look in the near future. I wanted to make sure the tank had basically a nice coverage of plants right off the get-go, so you guys would have a really good idea of where we're headed. And when we have that growth and we trim it back and grows back in a little bit, you'll get to see the scape looking its nicest, and hopefully that won't be too far away. I'm pretty excited. Thank you so much for watching. We finally got plants in this tank and everything's running, so the build's almost complete. We still want to get some fish in there. I want to talk a little bit about fertilization and stuff like that. Obviously, we want to do some maintenance and trimming once everything's grown in. The aquascape probably won't look its best until it's trimmed and grown back in, so I'm really excited to show that to you guys. If you have any questions or comments, drop those down in the comment section below. If you'd like to, you can also reach out to us on social media like Facebook. We'll talk to you there. And if you haven't already, do subscribe. We got some really cool stuff coming up for you, including something you guys have been asking for quite a long time that I am super stoked about. So yeah, come back and join me for that so we can, keep on tanking with some awesome tanks like this planted tank and the next tank I can't talk about that's not a planted tank and also probably not freshwater. Can't say much more than that. Styrogene repens or Lutuigia. It's Lutuigia. I decided to go with Cryptocoryne crispatula. As a general fluff plant in the tank. Why did I say fluff plant? What's a fluff plant?